Lord, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the things we can learn from your word. We know that first it's Jesus, that's the word made flesh. We know also that we have the written word and so much richness of your work in people's lives that we can learn from. So Lord, guide us and fill us and enrich us as we learn today about Ruth and the book of Ruth and what she and what her story do to make us more whole in our outlook of your work in people. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I again want to express appreciation for the rotation system in Sunday school that we've been doing. I think it's making a difference in everybody's lives, and that is partly boys and girls, and it's also partly the adults who are invested. Some are teachers, and some are disciples who are making a difference in other places. For every one of you that's here, thank God. So we're going to be taking up in the Sunday school program the book of Ruth. And of course what we like to do is have a session like this, and it's going to include a lot of the adult concepts of the book of Ruth, because the teachers, the staff, are adults. And we don't expect you to know, well, we expect you to know, but we don't expect you to teach everything to the children, because there are aspects of the word that you come to embrace as you get older. But if you know the three-dimensional richness of these episodes in scriptures, then the part of them that are for children you are better equipped to convey. And so this is going to be like an adult Sunday school class on Ruth, and that will make all of us better, both as disciples and as folks who convey it to the younger ones. So just say a little bit about the book before we get into its content. And this book is so short, you know, sometimes we're overwhelmed when we look at the Bible and we say, oh, I can't read all that. And especially you read books like Genesis or First Chronicles or something. You ever try to read through First Chronicles? Anybody ever do that? Okay. The first 10, 12 chapters are an endurance contest because it's nothing but family trees, nothing else. And most of the names, you have the faintest idea what matters about those lives. You just get these lists of names. Okay? Some parts of the Bible are overwhelming and they're really just endurance tests to get through them. Ruth is pretty manageable. It's short, just 3 or 4 pages. You know, you could read that in a sitting. And Ruth is a concise story. And you know, I think people are wired to understand stories. And that's a lot of what you've been teaching, you know, is concise stories from Jesus. You know, you teach the story of the Good Samaritan. My, what a rich and concise way of expressing God's work in people and what our vision has to be. These stories that we get, the 10 Commandments, there's no story, but it's focused, it's concise. Well, Ruth is a story. And it's focused and concise. And it's not going to catch the attention of children without a little help from you. But there's so much we can learn. The setting of Ruth is around the end of the Judges. In fact, if you look in your Bible, that's where you'll find it. You know, you have the 5 books, we call them the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books of the Bible. Where you hear all about the beginnings and God's people in Egypt and freedom from Egypt and getting the 10 Commandments and how they attempted in fits and starts to live that out as they went to the Promised Land. You have the book of Judges. I like to call Judges the period after they settled the Promised Land. I like to call that the Wild West time of Israel. 200 years where they didn't have a king. They weren't very organized. They were just kind of a bunch of little cities and communities that agreed that they had in common that they were Jews. And it's all these stories of the people losing faithfulness and then getting rescued by a deliverer that God raises up. 200 years of that. That's where some names that you've heard but maybe not connected come into place. Like, you know, Gideon and Samson. Some of these champions that God would raise up when the people of Israel were in such a crisis that they couldn't get out of it, and they needed a leader for the time. And so God raised these leaders, and some of them were judges who were deliverers militarily. Some of them were judges who were in the role of prophets. And of course, a prophet is someone who tells you how God sees things. It's not that very little of it has to do with the future. The future's in it, but only a small part. The main thing of being a prophet is being the person who tells people how God sees your situation. And the judges were sometimes military leaders and sometimes prophets. And a couple of them were both. And the story of Ruth is set during that wild, wild west time when, you know what the last verse of Judges is? After they tell you about all these episodes, and some of them were pretty crazy. Samuel was pretty crazy. But he died in an act of faithfulness. And the last verse of the book of Judges says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes." That's why I call it the Wild, Wild West. And that was the period of time in the Bible that the book of Ruth, that story of Ruth took place. It was in that Wild, Wild West time in the Bible. That's why in our Bible it's placed between Judges and Samuel. It's found fairly early. You have to know to look for Judges or Samuel, and notice just a couple of pages kind of tucked in between those two books. That's where it is, and that's why it's there in our Bibles. Now, I'll just mention this before I get into the story. Not all Bibles have the book of Ruth at that place. You may not have been aware of that. It's not something we have to spend a lot of time with the children on. But the book of Ruth, as we receive it, the story, the episode, the experience took place during the time of the Judges. But the book itself, the Jews in their Bible place it at the end with the books of wisdom, along with Esther and some of the others. They don't put it in the history books. And some people think that's because one of the most important themes of the book of Ruth came later, sort of like Daniel. You know, Daniel was a hero who lived during the time that the Jews were prisoners in Babylon. But the book of Daniel, in the form we have, it was written hundreds of years later to help later prisoners get through their trials. So the book wasn't always written when the event happened. Sometimes it was written later because people needed to know and learn the lessons from that event. And that's part of how the Jews see the book of Ruth. The story happened during the time of the Judges, but in the Jewish Bible it's at the end because one of the important lessons of Ruth had to do with what the Jews were going through later on. Okay, we'll get to that when we get to the lessons of the book. Let's remember the story. This story happens in the last generations of the book of Judges. And everybody can relate to this as they know their story. There was a severe famine. And probably most famines have drought involved. Even, you remember a couple of decades ago, we here, I think, are old enough to remember when there was a big famine in East Africa and there was a worldwide response to it. Remember that song, "We Are the World, We Are the Children"? And they got all these rock stars to sing a line here and a line there, and that made it a bigger episode so that the appeal was wider to give millions and millions of dollars to the starving people in East Africa. Most famines, even if they have some political roots, and some of them do, have to do with drought or blight. And it's a period of time longer than one growing season where you just can't grow your food. A lot of people from Ireland came to America because of the potato famine. The potatoes got a blight. They couldn't raise the thing that they used to feed most of their people. They were starving to death, and some of them came to America for a fresh start where they could grow their food again. Famines are terrible things. We haven't seen one since the 1930s. In America, there was something of a famine during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl days in the Middle States. Severe famine changes lives, sometimes for the rest of people's lives. And that was what happened that sparked the events of the book of Ruth. There was a terrible famine in Israel, but it wasn't everywhere. Some of the lands just over a couple of mountain ridges from them weren't having the same famine. And we could see that too when we get a lot of rain or a lot of snow. Eastern Pennsylvania had a drought a couple of years ago. Different place. Not that far away, but a different place. So there was a famine in Israel, but there wasn't a famine in some of the other places. A place called Moab that was probably, I've sometimes said that the Bible lands are something like the Allegheny Mountains. So people here might have an episode. Timely one for right now would be a snowstorm. And people in West Virginia's Alleghenies might not have it. Or vice versa at another time. Well, in this case, and it's not that far away, same general country, the land of Moab was a few days' journey by foot, maybe a week or so for folks who went slowly. And so people in Israel said, we can't live. We can't grow our food. And so they went to Moab. What you know about Moab is it kind of bordered the land of Canaan. It bordered the land of the people, the Hebrews. But the people there, well, they weren't Jews, and a lot of them were pagans, and a lot of them worshipped false gods. And a few generations before, when Moses had brought the children of Israel up from Egypt, the Moabites weren't real kind to them as they traveled up on their way to the Promised Land. And so this was a place that Jews weren't really comfortable around. But, when you're desperate, you'll go someplace for refuge. Joseph and Mary took Jesus to Egypt for refuge when Herod wanted to kill him. And they weren't real comfortable in Egypt, but they did it to save their lives. People in Syria went by the tens or hundreds of thousands out of their homeland where they had had a good life before the war and went wherever they could so that they wouldn't die. And some of them died anyway on the way. And some of them didn't have a place to land because nobody wanted them. It's a tough life when your home is destroyed or your home is a dangerous place to live. For the Jews at that time, it was because they couldn't grow anything to live. And they went to Moab. And this is important because the Jews didn't like or trust the people of Moab. But everybody understood why a Jew would leave their homeland if their lives were in danger. And they could say, I see why you'd go to Moab if you were going to starve. They understood that. They probably had ancestors who could tell those stories. So, there's a lady named Naomi. And she and her husband and her two little boys go to Moab to escape the famine. And there they establish themselves. They are spared starvation, but her husband dies anyway, of the same kinds of natural causes probably that would have happened if he had been back home. So she raises her boys, or she tries to, but eventually along the way, well, they grow up and they have nowhere to go. The famine has gone on, and they marry some of the local girls. And again, this might bend the rules for what Jews were to do. You're not supposed to have anything to do with those Moabite people. The boys did all their growing up there, and they couldn't come home. They had pretty much lost their heritage there as far as they knew. So they married some of the local girls because they thought they might be there for the rest of their lives. Well, before they could raise a family, they both died. Pretty tough story. You never take lightly somebody's grief. If someone loses a loved one, even if it's expected because of age or a long-term disease you've had time to think about, it hurts to say goodbye to one person, even if you expect the death. Not too many people expect to lose their children, and not too many people expect to lose their husbands in their youth. But that's what happened. All this happened to Naomi. She lost her home. She lost her husband. And not too long after she's living in a strange land, she loses her sons. All of us can tell stories of grief, but I'm not sure any of us sitting here can tell that story. That's Naomi's story. She was a foreigner in a strange land. And there came a time in her life when she felt she was at the end of life's trail, and that if she was going to die soon because there wasn't a whole lot left to hope for, she thought, well, at least I'll go home and I'll die in my homeland of Israel. I hear things are a little bit better there now. So she said, I'm going home. That's my roots. That's where I belong. And she gathered up her things, and she said, now, to her daughters-in-law, who in their youth were widows, childless widows. And she said, look, life has been hard. I don't expect you to go through what I've gone through. You have a home here. You have family, you have extended family, you have relatives, people know you, they speak your language. Stay here. You will find a life. You will probably find husbands. You're young. You'll probably have a family before you die. And a lot of people in those days died by their 40s. Think, how many of us would even be in this world today? It was a tough time in those days. Naomi said, the only life I have left is back where my roots are. I'm going home, and I'll find my roots. You stay here, and you'll renew yours. Good plan. And so, one of Naomi's daughters-in-law says, thank you, I love you, and she was on her way. And one of them hurt. She felt for Ruth's heart. And she said, everything you've said is true. And she said, we're bonded. I know what you went through when you came here. And that doesn't scare me. I want to be with you. No, you don't. You'll get over it. You've got a life here. You've got all those things. I know. But we're bonded. And as far as I'm concerned, you're my mother. And that's where those famous words come from. When Naomi is saying, stay, stay. And Ruth says, no. Don't press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I'll go. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. Your people shall be my people. And your God shall be my God. And where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. I don't think there's anybody around here that has the courage to do what Ruth did. She watched what Naomi went through all those years, a foreigner in a strange land, and she said, I know what it looks like, and I'm going to do it because you're my mother. And she wasn't even her mother biologically. She was her mother-in-law. And our culture gives you 1,000 reasons why you don't want to be around your mother-in-law. And she said, I don't care. You're my mother. And she went back to a strange land with a different language and a different God. She gave the rest of her life with no hope of ever having a husband. Why should she ever find a husband in Israel where everybody believes that Moabites are inferior human beings? Why should she ever go to a place like that and think she had a future? I don't think we have an idea what the sacrifice was that Ruth took on when she left her home and went with Naomi. And Naomi was about out of spirit. I don't know what she did to encourage Ruth. She did, but I don't know where she got it from. She got home and everybody said, welcome home. And she said, don't call me Naomi, which is a Hebrew word for pleasant. Remember, all those Hebrew names mean something. It's like when we say faith or grace, not what sound like nonsense syllables from somebody else's language. Naomi means pleasant. She said, don't call me pleasant anymore. The name doesn't fit. It hurts to hear it said because my life has not been pleasant and I don't think it's going to be. Where do I even land? You know, her husband was dead. Where would she go and claim property? Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. She'd had it with this world. And no wonder. I mean, we've all been through something like that, but I don't think any of us has been through all of it. Lose your home, lose your livelihood, lose your husband, lose your sons. What's left? except a daughter-in-law from another country that you have to apologize for having with you when you go around the Jews that don't like Moabites. That's what you have left. Call me bitter, don't call me pleasant. Well, for the rest of the story, if you notice, they didn't do that. They called her pleasant anyway. Maybe out of hope and encouragement, maybe because that was the only name she'd be known by. But they kept on calling her Naomi anyhow. I hope that somewhere along the line, God's kindness would shine through before she died. Well, she finds a place to live, and you know, in the Old Testament law, we learn the Ten Commandments, but we don't learn a whole lot more than the Ten Commandments. The Old Testament law has all kinds of rules about how to treat the poor and how to treat foreigners. Not everybody followed them, but they were there. And we need to remember some of those rules. You know, Jesus, when somebody said, what's the greatest commandment of all? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And then he said the second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I was hoping I could put my finger right on it, and maybe I can. What people don't know is that in the same chapter where Jesus said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19, he also says, you shall not plow your field to the very edges, you leave the edges for the poor. And it says, if someone who is foreign and strange comes to be among you, you will not treat them like outsiders. Put that in a contemporary context. If someone from another place comes and lives among you, you shall not treat them like outsiders, but you shall be as kind to them as you depended on people to be kind to you when you were strangers in Egypt. I am the Lord. Well, punctuation. That's part of the law of Moses that a lot of people, including the Israelites, choose to forget. We don't teach those parts of Leviticus 19 very often, but they're there. And it was because they were there that Naomi didn't come home and starve to death. She didn't have a house and property that she could call hers and build a fence around it, but she could live with the poor people that were around the edge of the landowner's fields. And the landowner, who was a distant relative of hers, was sensitive enough to those forgotten parts of Leviticus 19 that he followed that part of the law of Moses and left the fringes of his fields for the poor. And when his workers were done gathering up his harvest to sell, the gleaners would come out in the evening and they'd get what was left. It was sort of like what we talked about in church, those people in Grove City that went to the dumpsters at night. The gleaners would come out and they'd gather up what they could, and they stayed alive. It was because the landowner let the distant kinsmen who were poor live there, and probably some strangers and foreigners along the way that most people, including people today, don't want to have around even in their county or country, let alone, this person kept that place for the poor, and if the foreigners came, that was okay too. And that's why when Naomi came back, and she could vouch for Ruth, and she was willing to do it because Ruth's coming with her in the first place was a supreme act of love, but there was a place for Ruth anyway. And she too could go out with the gleaners, even though she wasn't a Jew. Even though it wasn't her home nation, her homeland, she was allowed to come out and gather some food and live. He didn't know who she was, so he asked some of the people that he did know, and they knew who she was. He said, well, she's Naomi's daughter-in-law. She came back, and Naomi was evidently not strong enough. Maybe she had grown old by that time and just couldn't go out and do it all herself. But Ruth was young and had some energy, and she went out and gathered for herself and for her mother-in-law and would bring it back. And when the landowner didn't know who it was, and he asked people that he figured did know who it was, he said, oh yes, that's Naomi's daughter-in-law. She's a Moabite. But she's out there and she's working hard to make sure her mother-in-law gets fed. And we said, wow, that's something. Tell you what, guys, when you're gathering up and you're finishing your day, have a little accident off the wagon and drop some of the grain and go, whoa, so sorry, but it's the end of the day, we can't gather it up and come on home. Make sure she sees you do it. He recognized that character in this foreigner that the Jews didn't want in their country, this probable pagan that the Jews didn't want anywhere in their borders. But he saw her character. She was taking care of her mother-in-law. And maybe he'd have done it anyway, as the law of Moses commanded. He said, leave a little extra for her. That's a good thing. And I know she'll do a good thing with it. And so that kept happening. And he said, by the way, keep an eye on her so that nobody messes with her, as is prone to happen in those unguarded places. And that went on and on. Things got better for Ruth and Naomi because one kindness recognizes and honors another. Somewhere in the second part of the story, isn't that a beautiful story all by itself? I mean, for crying out loud, what Ruth said in chapter 1 is enough to bring us to tears, if you didn't know any more about them. And hearing this little bit more is a wonderful story by itself, but it doesn't end there. Because Naomi recognizes that she's got to take care of this young woman that she could not take care of herself forever. And she said, you know, you need somebody. You're going to need to find somebody. And you don't have any advantages going for you here. When I die, you're stuck. Here's a custom that you can do. You can go and make sure that the landowner, whose name is Boaz, make sure that he knows who you are, and he'll find a way to look after you. And here's how the custom does. And she described it to Ruth, and Ruth went out and did this. And one evening, as Boaz is sleeping at the end of the harvest day, Ruth comes and takes his shoes off and sleeps near his feet. And that's a sort of a custom of servitude. It's a gesture. Not everybody did it, but those, you recognize it when it happened. And when he wakes and he sees her there, he says, who are you? And she says, my name is Ruth. And he says, oh, yes. I know who you are. I know what you've done. And I honor you. I honor you for what you've done and who you've shown yourself to be. So you're not like a lot of the young ladies around here that just kind of run hither and yon and don't take good care of their lives and their futures, don't think very heavily about what life's about. I know what you've done. You left your home. You left your future. You came to a place where a lot of people don't like you very much. And you've taken some risks and sacrifices when you could have had all the benefits of life in your homeland. Here you are taking care of your mother-in-law. Thank you for who you are. And that began a love story. And even though Boaz was probably half a generation older, and even though there was some risk involved, because Boaz is taking care of this foreigner, it begins a love story that ends with a marriage. But now there's no, like any classic love story, whether it's in an opera or a musical or wherever you see them, any classic love story, there are these obstructions, and you've already heard some that make it a beautiful story, but there's yet one more obstruction before you get to the climax of the story. Because by those same laws that we referred to back in Leviticus, and not too far away, the law was that if someone dies, their property goes to the next of kin. And if the first in line as next of kin can't have it, then somebody else can, who's a relative but not too much farther away. But they can opt to surrender it if they want. Well, and there's also a law in the Old Testament days that if a Jew marries and dies before he has children, his brother must make sure that his widow is cared for. And they even had a provision there that doesn't make much sense by today's marriage laws, that the brother could take her in as a wife and give her children, so that the land that would have been his brother's will not go unowned by his family and progeny. Well, of course, Naomi's in that situation. She'd lost her husband. Boaz was part of the tribe that was in that core of landowners. And he said, you know, I can take care of you, but before I do, there are people even closer relatives than I am, and they have a right to your father-in-law's land. I can't just take care of it and take care of you if they want it first. So he goes to the gate. This was the custom. He goes to the gate where these transactions are settled in the city. And he comes to the person who is closer to Naomi's husband than he is. And he says, we have to settle a transaction. I want to make sure this happens. You know that your brother died and his land is yours. He says, that's right. I want to redeem that land. He says, good. Good. However, if you redeem that land, you get Naomi and her daughter-in-law too. Which, of course, if you're looking at it from a selfish point of view, what it means is that he can't just take his brother's land. All he can do is make sure that his brother's land is cared for by his progeny, which means that he would do it as a good Jew. To take care of his brother's land, he takes care of Naomi and makes sure that her progeny get the land and the benefits. In order to do that, he has to marry Ruth. And there are no particular benefits involved in that. And so whether it was a matter of stress or a matter of a business transaction, the brother looks over the big picture and says, that's too much for me to handle. If you want to handle it instead, that's all right with me. Now, Boaz was loving, but he was also shrewd. He had a pretty good idea that that would come out. That was the obstruction to their getting married, was if the brother wanted the land and would take everything with it. Brother decides there's no benefit to him, so in the public place at the gate, his brother says, I don't want the burden. If you want it, okay. And his brother says, you want it? Boaz says, yeah. They do the transaction in public, and Boaz goes home, takes care of Naomi for the rest of her days, and marries Ruth. And they have children. And lived happily ever after. What a beautiful story. And so many things you can learn from it. You can learn that those who endure faithfully, both here and abroad, if you hang on and you trust through the darkest of nights, when you walk through a storm, this isn't from the Bible, but you've heard it, haven't you, somewhere? Rodgers and Hammerstein, when you walk through a storm, hold your head up high and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky, the sweet silver song of a lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain. Though your dreams be tossed and blown, walk on with a hope in your heart, and you will never walk alone. That's one of the morals of the book of Ruth. For Naomi and for Ruth, who swapped roles. It's a beautiful love story because Ruth and Boaz, across all these barriers, fell in love. They faced a challenge and an obstruction. They overcame it, and they went on and lived happily ever after and had children. Isn't that wonderful? But there's another element to the book of Ruth. that doesn't get taught very often. And it has a lot to do with the reason why the book of Ruth isn't where we have it in the Bible. It's where the Jews put it in the Bible, near the end, in the books of wisdom, because when they were organizing these books, they weren't looking at chronology, they were looking at theme and their journey. They told the story of Daniel hundreds of years after Daniel actually lived through those things, because they knew that another generation of oppressed people were going to need his hero stories and his martyr stories to face their martyrdom as well. And they needed the book of Ruth because they'd come to a point in their time when they were so nationalistic that they said among themselves, not always in the synagogue, but they said it and believed it, that the only good Gentile was a dead Gentile. Yeah. And that's where the Jews were when they were organizing their Old Testament books, so they put Ruth near the end, because they knew that's what they were going through at the time, where they were so sure that they didn't need to be tainted with those pagans and those folks who didn't deserve to be in their midst, let alone have hospitality shown to them. That they needed to cleanse themselves from such thing. And when they went back to the temple days and built the second temple in the time of Ezra, that's exactly what they did. They said, if you marry any foreigners, kick them out and send them home. You don't deserve to be with us. And nobody that's less than a pure Jew deserves to be with us. Beautiful and powerful as this story is, do you know what the punchline of the book of Ruth is? The last verses of the book. Ruth had a child, and everybody celebrated because Ruth had a child. And Ruth and Boaz, they named him Obed, and Obed became the father of Jesse, and Jesse became the father of David. Do you know what that means? It means that if you're going to throw out people that don't deserve to be in your midst because they're not yours completely, you got to throw out David. Because his great-great-grandmother was a Moabite. So, friends of faith, what do you think? Shall we show hospitality to those among us who are unlike ourselves? Or shall we be pure and throw out David? You can't have it both ways. That's the third theme of the book of Ruth. And boy, is it in harmony with the story of the Good Samaritan, isn't it? You're blessed to get to share this story with people of all ages, including our children while they're in their formative times. Tell the story as the Lord gives you spirit to do it, and we'll all be better for it. Amen.